Good morning, Vietnam! Euphemia Drew's dining room had all the windows open, but so still was the atmosphere that the 6 steady flames above the silver candlesticks, for though the western sun came slanting in from between the columns of the tower arch she had made Lily light up the table, preserved their small blue burning centers of life undisturbed. "How nice your candles look!" cried old Lawyer Beer, who, with his daughter Angela and Mr. Thomas Barter, made up the role of the guests. The old man's grizzled head, flaccid cheeks, and thin, spectacled nose bent against over his plate of clear soup, on the surface of which floated minute wafers of white paste. It's delicious. But Angela, a grave, fair girl of about 27 summers, an old man's child, improved upon her father's observation. "Candlelight by daylight always makes me think of Rome," she remarked. "So unnatural, the girl means," said Barbara Fell. "But you always did have a taste for the artificial, Euphemia." Lily Rogers, removing Miss Bibby's soup plate at that moment, was so arrested by this indictment against her mistress that she touched the lady's brimming wine-glass, and a tiny trickle of claret ran down upon the cloth. "Salt does it? Don't fret, girl," cried Miss Fell, covering the red stain with the minute crystals. Lily was not one to fret at such a misfortune, while Mr. Barter was looking at her. She plunged, on the contrary, into a prolonged and pensive reverie. But Charles Montague glanced in surprise at his sister. Why was she so considerate to Lily and so harsh with Rosie? Was he wrong in disliking this thin, angular, grey face with such heart-burning detestation? She was always amiable to Tom Barter. If Rosie were Lily and he were Barter, would peace, love, and harmony reign at Old Town Lodge? Tom Barter spoke up now. He was impatient to throw all his weight upon the side of the pageant before this formidable woman began condemning it. "I've got a personal favour," he said, "to beg of you 3 ladies." And he made a gallant little bow in the direction of Angela, whom he had only met once or twice before, and of whose cold, chaste, direct glances he was somewhat afraid. "I want you all to make sure you get good seats at the pageant by buying your tickets early. There are a lot of foreigners coming, several whole parties of them from Germany, and it won't look nice if the front rows are vacant. The mayor has been saving the front rows for the leading ladies of the town. He has not let his agents sell 1 ticket for those." At this reference to the mayor's agent, Mary, who was sitting next to old Mr. Beer, hesitated not to lift up her face. "It isn't whether you approve," she said eagerly and with a heightened color, "or disapprove of the thing as a whole. It's simply whether you would care to be entirely absent from something that's likely to be quite an historical event in the life of everybody here." Euphemia glanced quickly at her as she accepted a gold-bordered plate from the dreamy Lily. "Only too historical," she thought, "in your life, my unhappy darling." But she said to Miss Fell, "I think perhaps Mary is right, Barbara. We all owe a duty to Glastonbury, and whether we may personally think of our new mayor and his methods, we must admit that the man has the place very much at heart." "There won't be anything Romish about it, will there?" said Miss Fell. "I can answer for that," said Barter hastily. "Oh, no, our fear at first was that, in his evangelical simplicity, Mr. Gurd might be laughed at by some of our cleverer church people. But the vicar has been talking to him, and he made him see—" He stopped abruptly, anxious not to overdo his argument, and also, it must be confessed, a little puzzled how to round off this imaginary conversation. The sun was sinking now, and through the open windows, floating lightly and gently across the ruins, came the fragrance of many hayfields. Uncut as yet, the grass had become tall and feathery, and mingled with its vague aroma was a foretaste of something far more intimately sweet, the first breath of budding honeysuckle and dog roses. Angela Beer, beneath that calm white bosom and the low-cut light blue frock under that quiet forehead, with the fair hair parted so smoothly, was thinking just then very strange thoughts. She had recently met Persephone for the first time after a long interval, and the attraction of that equivocal creature had grown upon her night by night, since she had talked with her, into something like a feverish obsession. It had been difficult for her to behave adequately, even politely, in Persephone's presence. So troubling had the girl's personality been. She had wanted to run away from her. She had wanted to toss herself tempestuously, distractedly into her new friend's arms. Did she like me? She was thinking now. Did I look well? What did she mean by talking to me as she did, if she didn't want me for a friend? When she said that about life being so difficult, and the love of men being so gross and brutal, and it being so hard to find a person you could love wholeheartedly, did I make her understand how I sympathized? What is this character? Who is this now? Angela Beer. I don't know who that is. This is important. Angela Beer. Gotta go to the character thing. Angela Beer. I don't remember who that is. Okay, we got Young Toosie, Isaac Weatherwax, Lillian Louis Rogers, Mother Ledge, Beth, and Angela Beer, his daughter. John Beer, solicitor's daughter. Oh, okay. Oh, right. So she's like the one that's, she's the old maid or something. 27. Oh, right. Right, I get it. I remember now. Okay. That's going to be a bad strike in this town, announced Mr. Barter. If those Crow people aren't careful. You'd better give your cousin a hint, Mary. He wouldn't take my advice. He paused and looked at old Mr. Beer, anxious to make the lawyer believe that it was over the pure joint of industrial politics that he had quarreled with his late employer. Mr. Beer, however, as he ate his cutlets at once greedily and daintily with his old wrinkled face close to his plate, was thinking to himself, it's astonishing how Crow could put up with this fellow so long. He's an interloper. He's an intriguer. He's thoroughly shifty. I hope he doesn't take a fancy to Angela. No doubt he was feathering his nest in some scurvy way when Crow kicked him out. Yeah. Who's this Caporelli, who they're talking so much about in the Gazette? Inquired Miss Euphemia Drew. Since no one else seemed inclined to reply, Mary began explaining to her friend how the person in question was one of the famous old French clowns of 30 years ago. He's retired for a long time, she said, but he comes back occasionally for things of this sort. He's had an unhappy life. His wife ran away with a Chinaman. Cousin John told Garrett about him. He took me to him as one of his rehearsals. He's acting Dragonette in their play. Acting who, my dear? Inquired Miss Bibby. I'm not going to look up Miss Bibby. Dragonette, Miss Fell, King Arthur's fool. Barbara turned to Mr. Barter. I thought you said this performance was an evangelical affair, something like Pilgrim's Progress. Old Mr. Beer lifted up his head. I expect 'tis pretty well what the boys and girls like best, he said. A little incense and a lot of kissing. It cannot, of course, be true, Mr. Barter, threw in Miss Drew. When dear old Wallop told me yesterday what I talked to him at the cage he's always shut up in. It's true, madame, threw in Mr. Beer with a humorous grimace. You can count on it being true if it's Wallop who said it. But Miss Drew shook her head. What he said was that the part of our Savior was going to be played by that shabby Welshman who was looking for old Jones's shop. Mr. Evans is a queer bird to look at, said Tom Barter gravely, catching the eye of Lily as he spoke, and giving her one of those lightning-quick, reconnaissant glances of his that girls always understood and responded to. But he was at Jesus Oxford, he tells me. He certainly knows more about the history of this place than anyone else. But to act the part of our Lord, reiterated Miss Drew. It has always struck me as strange that anyone could do it, even in those old miracle plays. But now, and with this French clown you talked of... But Mr. Barter's mind had already wandered some distance from Paul Caporelli. He answered vaguely that he felt sure Miss Drew would find nothing objectionable in the pageant. He thought to himself, I've been a fool to tie myself up with that designing little bitch at the Pilgrims. I must edge out of that. I must give her the go-by. She's begun to rate her bloody virtue a trifle too high. I wonder if Lily would... But of course, there's her sister. That's what has always stopped me. But by God, she's a beautiful girl. Yes, and a sensible girl, too. And the incorrigible imagination of Mr. Barter began calling up such enticing and seductive images that when the real Lily, in her puritanical black dress and apron, came in again, the sight of her gave him quite a shock. She had reassumed her normal attire with a too bewildering rapidity. The dinner drew to its end at last. Lily was now taking the cheese plates away and placing before the guests Miss Drew's best set of Dresden fruit plates. The Meissen coffee cups, too, were brought in, and a silver pot that had belonged to her grandmother. She had even instructed Mary to buy a box of cigarettes for the close of the meal, and Mary, knowing the taste of her friend Tom, had bought some first-rate Virginian ones. The conversation began to revolve around the enigmatic figure of the new mayor. Well, not too new to us anymore, but I guess new in the book still. Young Robert Stilley at the bank, said Lawyer Beer. Tells me the fellow's spent thousands on this affair. I should think his family must be feeling it. Mr. Barter hastened to bring forward an aspect of Mr. Geard that had nothing to do with the expenditure of money. His reward for leaving Philip bit at his consciousness like a maggot at a rosy-cheeked apple. He talks of our Lord, he remarked, as if he were standing close behind him, or beside him. The man's always smelt of drink when I've been close behind him, said Barbara Fell. Rogers tells me, said Miss Drew, that he's been seen making faces at that poor slobbering boy who always stands on the pavement outside the Pilgrimses. I don't think, threw in Barter, that Louis got that story quite right. The version I've heard, and he glanced at Mary, for his informant had been none other than John, is that he made the boy understand him by signs, and that he always stops when he passes him, and that... Mary interrupted. I believe he's got some weird nervous sympathy. Mind you, I don't like him. There's something unpleasant about him, something frightening. But from all I hear, he has some nervous peculiarity which makes him imitate every infirmity he meets. That must have been what Louis meant. He must act idiotically whenever he talks to that idiot. All I can say is, said Miss Bibby, it's an outrage for a town like ours to have a mayor who's not responsible for his actions. He's a better doctor than I am in such cases, muttered her brother crustily. Hear how you talk, Manny, the lady cried. Anyone would think you were one of his converts. I've heard he drinks at the pubs with the worst characters in the town. And they say the last bank holiday he got so drunk at the Leg women's party that he took that sick niece of hers. Manny goes to see her. She's got some frightful disease. On his knees. I'll be ashamed to talk like that, Barbara. Everyone looked at Dr. Fell. He had spoken in a low voice, but with bitter distinctness. Miss Drew intervened. We've all of us talking scandal, I'm afraid, she said. You're right to rebuke us, Doctor. What do you think about it, Mr. Beer? Mr. Beer looked up from his grapes. Stilley thinks the fellow's mad, he said. He's been spending money like water this last couple of months. Charles Montague thought to himself, if I wasn't for my Mary here and some of these young girls who come to my clinic, I swear I'd take these tablets and end it. He finished his coffee in a gulp, and there came over him, as he put the empty cup down, a sensation that he had been suffering from several times lately, a sensation as if his life were merely running on by the mechanism wound up within it. while its heart, its soul, its meaning had fled somewhere else, and he had only to cry out in a loud voice, "But it's all husks and hollowness, but it's all worn rot and dust," and it would crumble to pieces. Well, we can all relate to that, huh? The conversation drifted on now to an uneventful exchange of local gossip. While Miss Drew's dinner party ebbed thus to its lame and impotent conclusion, Mr. Philip Crow emerged from the drive gate of the elms to inspect the appearance of the weather. Once out in the lovely June evening, it was now only a few minutes after 8, he strolled into the town. In the open space outside St. John's, he encountered Mr. Stilley, the cashier of the Glastonbury Bank. Mr. Stilley had himself come out after an early supper. He was a hard-working man of 40 who supported a pair of aged parents. To take the air, walk the streets a little, and see what was toward. Mr. Stilley had thin, reddish hair, a still thinner reddish mustache, and a drooping, melancholic face. But he was not really a melancholy man. Mr. Stilley accepted the pinpricks of chance and the joltings of time and tide with patient equanimity. He concealed a passion for taking photographs beneath his unruffled demeanor, and he was also extremely fond of using a fret saw. He adored his parents, who were both exacting and tyrannical. And one of the greatest pleasures of his life was when, at the time of the year, he went down to the brooks so that the old people might have watercresses to their tea. Mr. Stilley had unbounded respect for Philip Crow. When he found himself tonight overtaken by this gentleman, his tendency was at once, without question, to nod to him politely and sheer off. It was with surprise, and even with some misgivings, that Mr. Stilley heard Mr. Crow express a wish that he would accompany him to Torfield to have a glance at what might be going on out there on this fine night of the 2nd of June. Mr. Stilley, conscious that he had left his only father and his only mother, as he was accustomed facetiously to call them, playing at dominoes, acceded to the manufacturer's suggestion. Two men walked rapidly down Chilkwell Street, past the vicarage gate, past Miss Drew's gate, past the Taith barn, from which the symbolic creature of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John regarded them without an eyelid's flicker, past St. Michael's Inn, where Mad Bet made silent faces at them, past Chalice Well, where the red water gurgled at them in disregarded neglect, till they came to Torfield. The gate was open, and they went in. It was just like the fields of any ordinary fair, this place tonight, with sailcloth barriers pegged firmly into the earth, a confusion of lively voices reaching them through the warm twilight. They skirted in the barrier, and standing beside a crowd of casual intruders, whom the players had no authority to exclude, they surveyed, with the distancing wonder of grown-ups people in the presence of childish nonsense, the bewildering chaos of the unusual scene. Mr. Stilley opened his mouth twice to utter some suitable comments before he had the courage to speak. Then he said, "Makes one think of what one reads about America." "What do you mean?" asked Philip. This natural but not very kind question disturbed the play of Mr. Stilley's already agitated allegiance. "They perform performances a good deal, don't they? In the open air?" muttered the cashier of the bank. "Do they?" said the other laconically. "I was never there." Mr. Stilley murmured something about Indians and sank into nervous silence. To be standing at this hour with the owner of the Glastonbury Dye Works and in the presence of such an unusual scene was too much for him. He hoped that his parents had not yet noticed the length of his absence. Well, I guess I'll have to end it now. I want to go rambling on. No, I'm going to go on. I'm almost at the end of this chapter, and why not? It was apparent that it would not be for lack of varied and fantastic costumes or of contradictory and vehement directions or of excitable crowds or emotional young people, that the Gerd pageant would fail, if it did fail. Philip glared at it all with a cold, pinched disdain from beneath his cloth cap. There shot forth into the hurly-burly of that motley assembly, from this man's concentrated detachment, radiated waves of accumulated contempt. His angry thoughts pursued one another through his brain like marching soldiers. They came and went. They wheeled and counterwheeled. They obeyed the commands of Philip's will in much better order than those excitable lads and lasses were obeying their distracted professionals from Dublin. Humanity, he thought. As they were 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, so today. To mold them, to drill them, to dominate them. It's all too sickeningly easy. And he thought, how much more worthy a resistance is offered to me by the deep, dark interior rocks of the Mendips. How much better to struggle with machinery against the inertness of blind matter than to try to make anything of such insects. It won't be necessary to plot and scheme to defeat Gerd. All I shall have to do will be to hold off my hands. This crazy confusion, these bewildered people, these bare legs and riotous dancing, why, it's a bacchanalian orgy. He'll make the town a laughing-stock. The thing he's stirring up here, any fool can see it, is pure religious madness under the mask of theatricals. The man's a lunatic. This sort of thing never has been and never will be tolerated in England. I'm afraid I've got to go now, Mr. Crow. I didn't expect to stay out so long. My people will be wondering where I am. It had taken Mr. Stilly a long time to make up his mind to utter this daring ultimatum. His voice, when he did utter it, was like the voice of an unhappy schoolboy murmuring something about cricket or football to a preoccupied headmaster absorbed in a nice point of Thucydidean grammar. Thucydidean grammar. Whatever. What did he say? Oh, all right, returned Philip. Wait 1 minute, Stilly, and I'll walk back with you. They left the field, passing on their way out that fallen trunk on the mossy sides of which Sam Decker had searched for rare toadstools on the day when Mr. Evans first thought of taking the part of Christ in the pageant. Remember that? It was a couple 100 pages ago, maybe. Meanwhile, the same Sam, struggling pitifully with his love for Nell, had entered his favorite shrine in Glastonbury. This was a little chapel dedicated to St. Patrick, lying behind the women's almshouse near the entrance to the ruins. A chapel which still possessed an original stone altar left undisturbed by the Protestant Reformation, and carried upon its wall the heraldic arms of St. Joseph, a green cross between two golden cruets. Never had these Arithmethian arms, never had that stone altar, beheld a worshipper such as poor Sam showed himself that night. He was on his knees at the altar. He was alone in the little chapel. Lower and lower he bowed his head, clenching his fingers as he bent forward. But it was not in the attitude of prayer that his hands hung by his side. They swung there savagely in the manner of a prize fighter's fists, and, as they swung, the backs of his knuckles kept striking against the front of the stone altar. There was something about his posture as he knelt, swaying his whole body backwards and forward, that was pitiably grotesque. An imaginative observer might have received the impression that an animal was praying. Was there any portion of Sam's nature that exulted in the atrocious task that he had laid upon himself, the task of doing not his will, but what he conceived to be the will of a tragic, superhuman being? Yes, the soul itself, in this grotesque swaying body with clenched fists, exulted in what it was doing. Sam's soul seemed to be able to gather to itself a peculiar consciousness quite apart from the rest of Sam's sensibilities. His soul seemed to be holding his body and his will in a tight leash, as a man might hold a wild-eyed bull by a ring through its nose. His soul seemed to be saying to his natural sense and his natural will, "You must go through this because Christ went through it. I care not how you suffer, so long as you go on, day by day, doing His will, and not your own." And all the while Sam suffered there, swaying in his anguish like a great bleeding animal, held by a steel ring through his nose. The man-god that he invoked was struggling in vain to reach the consciousness of this mad perverter of his secret. In vain! In vain! Against the power lust in the soul of a man, when it has once tasted the wild delight of taking up its own body and its own will and its own nervous sensibility and forcing them to act against the grain, there's only one deity that can prevail, and that deity is not Christ. How could Christ, as he swept now like a cloud of weed smoke under the door of St. Patrick's Chapel, relax the tension of this soul, that's pulled and jerked so remorselessly at the nose of a praying earth beast? But Christ was not, at that vaporous Glastonbury afternoon, oblivious of his poor, besotted servant Sam. Although he tried in vain to change his, by invisible reasoning, the incorrigible obstinacy of Sam's perverted mind, upon external events he could exercise a certain degree of control. He now put into the head of young Elphin Cantle, with whom Sam used sometimes to go for walks, some surreptitiously into the church. To come surreptitiously into the church. I think I remember Elphin. He's kind of like stately, plump Buck Mulligan. Elphin, like many other boys of the town, had a passionate love of Sam. Mother Legg, when in her cups, had recently said of young Toosey that Sam Decker had become a seducer of boys. Nothing could have been more pathetically unjust. Sam did not, in his secret heart, care at all for boys. He walks with the oddest, queerest, and most unhandsome among them, and Elphin was certainly one of these. Were part of his general scheme of life. He knew that there were lots of boys in Glastonbury who, hating cricket and football and not caring for girls, were profoundly lonely and unhappy. To these boys he gave a good deal of his attention, which they repaid tenfold as far as emotional response was concerned. But Sam knew nothing of the strength of the feelings he excited. When Elphin peeped into St. Patrick's Chapel, he was thrilled but not surprised to find Sam there. He had looked in before, under similar occasions, but had never dared to approach the object of his passionate adoration. Today, however, pushing forward by the invisible pressure of a hand upon his shoulder, the thin-legged, pale-faced boy moved shyly up to his idol's side. As he approached, he fancied he caught the sound of a huskily drawn sob in the man's throat. The sound hurt him to the quick will. Did Elphin Cantle know what it was to go in solitary places and utter sounds like that? Missing a period there. The boy went close to him, and still pushing forward by the invisible hand, whispered his name, doing as he whispered it what Russian serfs in former times did to their masters, that is to say, kissing him lightly on the shoulder. Anyone but a born naturalist like Sam would have started violently and even uttered a cry. But long training in the woods and fields had given Sam under any nervous shock, and indeed in all these things his nerves were like tough wood, the poise of a, my air quotes, red Indian. "Oh, it's your elf, is it?" was all he said, and he began rising stiffly to his feet, unceremoniously wiping his eyes with the back of one of his relaxed fists. Elphin Cantle said not a word. "Had you tea yet?" inquired Sam, stretching himself and looking round for his cap and stick. Elphin shook his head. "Come on, then. Let's see what Penny's has got for us today." Well, with that, I guess I'll end. That was the end of the chapter Omens and Oracles. And tomorrow we'll begin the next chapter, which is The Pageant. Until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.